My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
And the need to use diplomacy and build international consensus to resolve our problems whenever possible.
Our diplomats are working with a range of partners to strengthen human rights protections.
This is not a time to undercut our diplomats.
Today, in our boasted modern civilization, we are facing just...
Hello, and welcome to Diplomatic Immunity. I'm Kelly McFarland, Director of Programs and Research at the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy at Georgetown University. How has the Biden administration approached global development and humanitarian aid? As the world enters the third year of the coronavirus pandemic, how are the three C's, COVID, conflict, and climate change, compounding one another? And how can scholars and practitioners of diplomacy work together to confront these challenges? For this episode of Diplomatic Immunity, I spoke to Joel Hellman. Joel Hellman is the Dean of the School of Foreign Service. As Dean, he leads the research, teaching, and outreach efforts of the school. Throughout his career, he has worked on issues of governance, conflict, and the political economy of development around the world, both in academia and in international organizations. Before coming to Georgetown, he spent 15 years at the World Bank, where he most recently served as Chief Institutional Economist and previously led its engagement with fragile and conflict-affected states as Director of the Center on Conflict, Security, and Development in Nairobi, Kenya. Let's have a listen. Welcome to the podcast, Joel, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Kelly, for having me, and congratulations on Diplomatic Immunity. I listen, and it's a great show, and I'm glad to be on it.
Well, I appreciate it. You and my mom are avid listeners, it seems like. So, but today, as you know, Joel, we're doing a sort of a series on, looking at the Biden administration at 1 year in and sort of what to look forward to and some of the major issues that we should be watching for. So today, you've spent years in the development field. To start things off, I'm quite sure you remember, late last year, we had a high-level visitor to campus when USAID Administrator Samantha Power came and gave a major address on campus. And she touched on a lot of different topics, but stressed that USAID needs to critically reassess its role across the globe. This includes seeking more equity and inclusion in aid programs. She also stressed the importance of working with local communities to create programs that work best for them and steer clear of working through entrenched systems that helped build these inequities in the first place. With your experience in development, what do you view as some of the major trends in the field right now, and how do we make it more effective moving forward?
Well, first of all, we really enjoyed having Administrative Power here on campus to give actually her vision for where USAID is going to go, the first statement that she made in the leadership role at USAID. And I think she's brought energy and dynamism to USAID. What she largely focused on was how USAID works and whether USAID could work more effectively. And that was across the board on almost all the issues that it impacts. And I think that's necessary and that's important. However, actually, I don't think it gets at what I feel is sort of essentially almost a crossroads in development and development practice that we're coming up with, especially as I think of the next generation of students who are going into development and what they're going to be facing in their lives. For the last 70 years, development was mostly about, as it should be, poverty reduction, and poverty was mostly focused, or the biggest numbers, I should say, of the poor were in large countries that were building up the basic foundations for growth and development. And they were China, India, Indonesia, Bangladesh, Pakistan. They had a significant development challenge, but they did it largely in a reasonably sort of stable environment, especially over the last sort of 30 years, politically and socially. And they've made tremendous strides in poverty reduction. If we start to look at where poverty not only is, but where poverty will be, the largest share of the world's poor in the next 25 to 30 years will be situated not in those big, populous, relatively stable, but poor and developing countries. They will be in conflict-affected and fragile states. This used to be a niche business in development, because it wasn't important, it's because essentially that's not where the largest bulk of the poor was. But because of the dynamics of incredibly fast poverty reduction in these large populous countries, and the very, very slow pace of poverty reduction in the fragile and conflict-affected states, it means that the share of global poverty reduction is changing. And really the dominant challenge of the next 30 years is going to be, how do we essentially figure out a way to finally change the course of poverty and poverty reduction in these fragile and conflict-affected states. To me, that's the central issue. And the failure, the remarkable failure of the world's most expensive and most extensive development effort, that would be Afghanistan over the last 20 years. The dramatic failure of that has essentially almost taken that issue off the agenda. Nobody wants to talk about fragility and conflict anymore. The feeling is, we tried that, we've done it, and we did it terribly, and we shouldn't do it again. And the lesson that we take out of Afghanistan is, we shouldn't get involved in these kinds of cases. And yet we have no choice but to get involved in those cases, because that's where the world's poor are and will increasingly be. And as we know, what happens in those countries doesn't stay in those countries. What happens in those countries impact the entire world through the migration channel, through terrorism and violence, through global health, and a whole range of other issues. So my view is that we're at this crossroads in which we don't know yet what is really going to change the course of poverty reduction in these fragile and conflict states, because it's complex, it's difficult, it's highly politicized, it's linked at the interaction of security and development, not just economic issues and know-how and technical assistance, but it's really about this complex interrelationship between politics, security, and development. And my feeling is that's got to be front and center. And it's at this very moment that not only is it not front and center, but it's almost off the agenda. And I really had wished to hear from Administrator Power about how post-Afghanistan are we going to take these issues as seriously as they need to be.
The example of Afghanistan is a stark one, and is spot on for the next question in dealing with this notion of food security and conflict and climate and COVID, along with corruption. And we run some scholar practitioner working groups here at ISD, and the last couple have looked at food insecurity and conflict and the threat posed by kleptocracies. So, looking at the intersection between COVID, conflict, and climate, and then corruption and how that all links together. And on the one hand, food insecurity, as you know well, drives conflict. And then on the other hand, conflict drives food insecurity. Meanwhile, corruption undermines efforts to develop more sustainable local agriculture, infrastructure for that, and economic expansion. And it's clear, as you noted, in a globalized world, that all of these issues are interlinked. Right now, there is no better example of that than Afghanistan, as you just mentioned. If you look at the amounts of money that were poured into Afghanistan in the last 20 years and what they have to show for it, and what disappeared throughout that period due to corruption, but now also facing arguably one of the largest humanitarian food crises in the world as well. Those things are all interlinked and interconnected. And how do you see sustainable development practices playing into trying to solve those interconnected issues? Just humanitarian aid is not going to suffice any longer. It's just sort of putting a Band-Aid but not curing the problem. And how do we move forward to looking at development more holistically through the food security side, through the corruption side, and taking into account things like climate change and all of that?
Well, look, it's a great set of questions. And the interaction between food security and this, and these issues of conflict and corruption and governance and kleptocracy, I think highlight the big difference that I'm just talking about a little earlier, which is that when we talked about development over the last 70 years, if you think about India, if you think about China, if you think about Indonesia, right, there were food security issues at various points of time in those countries. And really what development was about was working on agricultural issues, agricultural extension, helping seed varieties, irrigation, land ownership, and various forms of technical know-how and assistance, how to improve crop yields, how to improve productivity in agriculture, how to improve agricultural extension services so farmers have more significant livelihoods and possibilities for growth and development. And of course, capital and some capital injections that are necessary to do some of the major investments that are still needed, right? But the issues that you raise, they're not about the technical know-how that leads to the effective production of food. It's not about agricultural extension and how to give farmers better opportunities. And it's not about any technical know-how issues, nor is it even about the capital investments that are necessary. I mean, we talk about Afghanistan. More money was invested in the Afghanistan development effort than was invested in the entire Marshall Plan, with the reconstruction of Europe. So you can't say that this was starved for capital or starved for technical know-how. There was technical assistance really coming out the wazoo, as they say in Afghanistan. The real problem is food insecurity is a function of the corruption, governance, and conflict issues that essentially, create the deep instability that impacts all aspects of life, including agriculture and agricultural production. So the bottom line is that if you want to solve the problems in a place like Afghanistan, you've got to solve the drivers of conflict. I actually would argue that food insecurity is not a driver of conflict. Food insecurity is an outcome of the deep political polarization, fragility, and weakness of government that leads to kleptocracy and corruption. And I think we need to think seriously about whether or not our aid architecture, our development architecture, is really well situated, well suited to deal with those problems, right? Because first of all, we know there's a security dimension here. And that's very, very complex. How does development and security interrelate? How do you do development in insecure environments? What are the different roles of different actors? Because development actors are not security actors. And as we learned very much from the Afghan situation, security actors are not development actors, right? It's very, very hard to deliver development at the edge of a gun. You need to have these things working in a very, very different way. And yet these two sectors, security and development, are almost completely separate. There's very, very little interaction. There are different kinds of people who go into it with different training, different mindsets, different cultures, different processes and procedures. And I would add another layer of that, and that's the politics and the political economy of corruption, right? Because when you're talking about corruption, corruption is a political set of issues, right? Now, that's not to say that corruption only happens in some of these fragile and conflict-affected environments. We all know well that corruption is almost a universal problem. But we also know that the level of political constraints, checks and balances, and other things that would impact the depth and level of corruption in these fragile and conflict-affected environments is so much weaker than in other countries that it's almost it's just debilitating. The corruption becomes not just a distortion; it becomes a kind of almost a debilitating disease that causes the fragility syndrome. So, if you add the layer of understanding the political roots of corruption and kleptocracy, and understand that that's yet another layer with security and development that we have to understand and integrate into an overall platform of how to work effectively in these countries. It means that we've really got to rethink our development architecture because, to be honest, it's not well suited to deal with this intersection of issues. I worked for those many, many years you referred to in the beginning of the podcast in the World Bank. And the World Bank has tremendous know-how and tremendous knowledge on many aspects related to development, right? But it's not an organization suited to working in insecure environments. And it's not an organization that even has the mandate to work on the political side of the issues that deal with corruption and kleptocracy, even though they have tried hard to make corruption a more prominent development issue.
It's extremely important. You mentioned the changing the infrastructure of not only USAID and how we look at these things, but the broader development community in general. And I think, that's exactly what the group of scholars and practitioners that we had talking about food insecurity and development mentioned as well, that the world is different than it has been the prior 70 years. And the institutions and ways in which we go about our development aid need to change with it and tweak as they go forward.
And I would say they're kind of fundamental issues. They're really not, they're beyond tweaks in the sense that, if you think about it, the military, in one of the issues in Afghanistan was the military was essentially performing the development, a whole range of development roles. The military is not suited or set up to do that. it may very well be in the future that we need to rethink how the military engages as part of counterinsurgency strategy, as part of its own, broader strategic framework. But there's going to have to be massive change before the military can effectively integrate development thinking into that, the nature of their institution. I think the same thing with the big development institutions, especially the big economic development institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, the regional development banks. And then, of course, on the political side, you've got the UN and the UN system, which, even though it's meant to be a partner of a lot of the development institutions, they still work in completely different cultures, almost completely different ways, and they find it very difficult to interact. So something more dramatic needs to be done. And it gets back to your first question, which is that I would have loved to hear an articulate vision of how we're going to tackle the complexity of those interrelationships and the weaknesses of the current development architecture to deal with the challenges of the next generation of poverty reduction.
So with that in mind, how do you think the current administration has done in their first year so far on the development side of things? And with that, what are you, I assume you're looking for more of that kind of explanation and thought process happening in the years to come.
Yeah, look, I think that this current administration is so focused on the domestic aspects of COVID, and I want to underline the domestic aspects of COVID, and of course, so focused on the domestic politics of U.S. Policy making, that development is essentially, I don't see it anywhere on the agenda. Obviously, in comparison to the Trump administration, Biden has stabilized, what might be seen as a hemorrhaging of expertise and skill, and a weakening of some of the core development institutions that were not only neglected under Trump, but also, in many ways intentionally weak. And then that's largely stopped. And I think he's appointed very competent professional folks to, essentially run the development architecture. What I don't see is I don't see a clear development vision coming out of this administration. I'd be hard pressed to tell you what this administration's view is. I heard what Administrator Power wants to do in USAID, which is great, but it goes well beyond USAID, and I've not seen any articulation of that. And as you might imagine, given the other pressures that the Biden administration is under, they're not feeling terribly pressured in order to do that. And to some extent, it's hard to blame them given what is on their agenda. I would give the Biden administration as a faculty member an incomplete, because I just think that they haven't really taken this on in a serious way. I understand why they haven't taken it on. There are many other things in the agenda, but I think they need to take it on because it's impacting of all of us through the continued problems in COVID. I mean, because there'll be new variants coming, many times over, and we're going to be living in this for a very long period of time. Not to mention the fact that the situation in Afghanistan and the situation in other fragile states, which we kind of now ignore and say it's finished, we're out, it doesn't matter what happens there because we're not involved. Those things are going to impact us in very significant ways very soon.
Yeah, and it makes an important point too on just reiterating the importance of domestic politics and international affairs, and having to deal with those things, and how they can sort of hamstring what you can or have the ability to do on the international front. Dean Hellman, I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with us today, and this has been a great episode. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Kelly, and congratulations for everything that ISD is doing. I look forward to being a continued dedicated listener to Diplomatic Community.
That was Diplomatic Community. Thanks for listening to this episode. Please share the episode on social media and tell your friends and colleagues to come find us wherever they listen to podcasts. This episode was produced by Alistair Somerville. Audio editing for this episode was done by Aaron Jones. Thank you to the Carnegie Corporation of New York for their support for this podcast. Follow us on Twitter @GU Diplomacy and visit our website, isd.georgetown.edu, to learn more about our work. Until we meet again.